to turn over the waiting room management to Kristen Totalben, who is the editor-in-chief of College and Research Libraries, and introduce myself and the panel a bit for today. My name is Emily Drabinski. I am a associate professor and critical pedagogy librarian at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. I am also the book review editor for College and Research Libraries, a position I've held for the past 3 years. I'm coming up to the end of my term, and I'll say a few words and invite Kristen to say a few words at the end of the session about the book review editor position, which will be open to interested folks. So if you find yourself captivated by the discussion of book reviews over the course of today, think about taking on the role. It has been an incredibly meaningful experience for me. And I would love to have someone in that position who can carry on the great history of book reviews in college and research libraries. So I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves, but just for a little framing about how I think about reviews and how I've thought about the section since I've been editor of that part of the journal. I read a lot. I don't know if other people in the room read a lot. I also write a lot, and I pay very close attention to the professional literature because I care a lot about the field. When I took over as the book review editor, I had two sort of intentions. The first was to be really explicit in efforts to bring conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion in our field to the pages of the journal, right? We talk often about how important diversity is, but often we don't see that reflected in the professional output in our journal. And I saw that definitely in the book review section as I looked at the issues and thought about taking on this role. So the first thing I did was sort of be clear with myself that the priority was to make sure that we had racial, ethnic, and all kinds of diversity, but particularly racial diversity reflected both in the reviewers of titles as well as the books that we selected. The professional discourse is too often entirely white, very sort of Western in its focus. So thinking about ways to expand that was a priority. The second thing that I was really interested in was expanding the scope of the kinds of books that we reviewed. So our profession produces lots and lots of materials for practitioners, right? Like how to teach using stand-up comedy in the classroom was a recent one that came out, thinking about using open educational resources and those kinds of things. And those absolutely are essential to have those kinds of books reviewed and discussed in the journal and discussed by librarians. But then there's all the other parts of academic discourse that intersect with what we do as libraries. So paying attention to conversations about classification and cataloging that happen in social sciences, conversations about the classroom that happen in education and other kinds of fields. So one of the things I love about academic librarianship is how interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary we are. And we get a real opportunity in the book review section to put librarians in conversation with those other fields and to bring what's being discussed in other areas of academia into the library field as well. So that was sort of how I approached the issue. I've been I'm so pleased to be joined today by a handful of the excellent reviewers that have published in the journal over the last year. And I'd like to invite each of them to share a little bit about themselves and their reviewing experience to get us started. So Darren, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So good afternoon and hello, everyone. My name is Darren Sweeper. I am the Government Documents and Research Services Librarian at Montclair State University in New Jersey. I reviewed Thomas Mullaney's and Christopher Wray's Where Research Begins, choosing a research project that matters to you and to the world. I chose to review this book because I was really looking for a text, something that was different, something that sort of challenged conventional wisdom about research. I also wanted something that I could use in my own personal research, as well as something that I wanted to recommend to my students. So when I came across this particular book, I was really pleased to see it because at a particular time, I was really starting to investigate and think a lot about what I was teaching my students in my research orientated courses, or whether or not I was actually teaching them how to do research. So for me, like I said, I wanted to choose something that I could use and something I could recommend my students to also use. My experience in reviewing this book was really an excellent one. I really enjoyed reading the book. One, because it challenged a lot of the assumptions that I had about the research process, as well as confirming some suspicions I also held about what we were doing in terms of research. So for me, the main goal, uh, it challenged me to think about research and what does research and what does it mean and how are we sort of meeting the research needs of our students. That was a big thing for me. And so the third question was how does reviewing shape your reading of the book? I was, like I mentioned earlier, I was looking for something different from the myriad of works that were currently out there about how to do research. I wanted something more than just the kind of how-to mechanics of research. I wanted something that wasn't overly didactic, but something that could really help me, one, become a better researcher myself, and one that I could, confidently recommend to students. A lot of times, students may be asked to read books that are maybe too pedantic in their tone, or maybe not written for their particular level. So, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted something that I could use and something that I felt comfortable in recommending to
Darren,
students. Yes.
could you speak up just a little bit?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, just in closing, like I said, my whole purpose for selecting the book and reading the book was something that I wanted to inform my own professionalism, as well as something that I could offer my students to use. And I was really pleased with the book. One, because like I said earlier, it challenges some of my earlier assumptions about reading, about research, and it also was just an interesting and nuanced book that I really enjoyed. And I guess that's it for me.
Thanks, Darren. I'd like to invite Lynn Stahl to go next.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Lynn Stahl. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Humanities and Interdisciplinary Studies Librarian at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut. I reviewed an edited collection called Assembly Codes, The Logistics of Media by Matthew Hockenberry, Nicole Starosielski, and Susan Zeiger. As far as how I chose the book, actually, Emily emailed me after reading a piece I'd written for College and Research Libraries News about sort of surprising non-intersections between digital humanities and library science, and about the limitations of disciplinarity, and suggested this book. And I kind of read a blurb and thought it sounded pretty interesting. I would say that the experience was both challenging and galvanizing, especially because it was an edited collection. It was hard to think about how to synthesize all of the different arguments and approaches, and how to decide which to mention specifically within the review. But at the same time, I think all of the variety within the book gave me a lot of different footholds, right? There were authors who were in performance studies, and then there were authors who were in sort of much more quantitative communication studies types of fields. So quite a lot going on. And it was also a good reminder of how nice it is just to read and think about ideas that are new to you. And as far as how the act of reading for review shaped my reading of the book, I think reading to write a review sort of requires paying attention in a way that's different from when you're reading in service of a specific research project, for example, or reading to think about, can I use this in a class or something? But it's also liberating to sort of just evaluate a book on its own terms, rather than in terms of what use value it might or might not have to you individually.
Thanks, Lynn. Anders.
Hi, I'm Anders Tobiasen. I'm the Multimedia Development and User Experience Librarian and Assistant Professor at Boise State University out in Boise, Idaho. I use he, him pronouns, and I reviewed Nathan Johnson's Architects of Memory, Information and Rhetoric in a Networked Archival Age. And actually, I kind of got into this because Emily put out a call, I think, on maybe the abolitionist list for a book reviewer for a different text, and I responded that I wasn't interested in reviewing that one, but I was really interested in reviewing in general. And so she sent me back a potential book, and I took a look at it, took a look at the book abstract, at the author, decided I was pretty interested in it and right up my alley in terms of my interest in sort of marrying philosophy or critical thinking about rhetoric, memory, and then the stories we tell ourselves about librarianship. So I kind of immediately said yes. And my experience reviewing this book was really interesting. It's probably the most frustrating and most interesting book I've read in a really long time. Given its emphasis on the rhetorical tradition, I had to do quite a bit of outside reading to make sure I understood everything that the author was sort of emphasizing. And then as I wrote the book review, I kind of started to think of it as almost 2 or 3 separate books, and it's kind of a weird thing that way. And this made it really a challenge to review, but it was also really interesting. I had to read the book at least like 3 times, maybe 4, before I really got a handle of how I was going to review it and what the story I was going to tell about it. And for me, that's kind of the key. Whenever I do a book review or read a book to do that kind of thing, I want to tell a story about the argument of the book. That's really important. It's not just like to critique it or give a basic review, but I think academic reviewing sort of gives you that sense of like, how do we tell the story for other people to understand it? And then I also ended up writing a few more words than I was originally supposed to, but that's because I really felt the book kind of needed them in order for especially folks not in the rhetorical tradition to understand what was going on. And I think it's a pretty important text, at least for me, because it challenges us to think a lot more critically about how our work creates meaning and public memory. And this has been coming up like all over the place for me in all kinds of different ways. And I think the book has ended up sticking in my consciousness a lot more than I ever thought it was going to. And then the last question is sort of, what are the things you do when you do to review a book? The first thing I do is I read it with no preconceptions. I read it like a book I was assigned for a grad seminar, which I think is pretty helpful to think about it that way. And then I look for a theme in the book, and then I take more detailed notes. And then after that, I kind of like really try to tease that out and then think about the audience for my review. So for this, it was librarians. For other things, I could have really written a different review for a completely different group. And I think that's kind of a really important thing to do. So that's me.
Thanks, Andres, and apologies for mispronouncing your name
Oh,
again,
no worries.
which I'm sure I'm not the only one, but I
No.
apologize. Mallory.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mallory Rawls. I am a humanities librarian at Florida State University. I use she, her pronouns. The book that I reviewed was called The Trouble with Passion: How Searching for Fulfillment at Work Fosters Inequality. And I was reached out to by Emily based on some work in my research interest in vocational awe. The experience for me was really great. This was the first published book review that I've done. The way I approached the book review is how I approached it as a grad student. And so my background is in history, and in history, we do a lot of book reviews. Like as grad students, that's what we did, was a whole lot of book reviews. And that's how I approached doing this book review. But it was a really great experience for me because I really enjoyed the book, and it goes hand in hand with my thoughts about librarianship and work and capitalism and labor. And so it was a really fun read for me to read. And, now I kind of can't like shut up about it. I talk about the book all the time. And so that was pretty much my experience. And reviewing the book shaped my reading of the book was, I can recognize that I kind of had a bias. And then this kind of confirms my own biases, but I really like the way that Erin went about doing the book and how she wrote the book. And so that kind of, I think, like morphed how I read the book and how I did the review of it. But it was a great experience all in all. So that's my experience.
Thanks, Mallory. Kaya.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kaya McLeod. I'm the Indigenous Cataloging Librarian up here in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a member of the James Smith Cree Nation up here in Canada. I'm the diversity quota. And what I reviewed was a very long title: The Handbook of Research on the Role of Libraries, Archives, and Museums in Achieving Civic Engagement and Social Justice in Smart Cities. So kind of a mouthful right there. And the way that I chose it, I actually had the editor of the book reached out to me because of one of my previous reviews and asked if I'd be willing to read this 565-page book and write a review. And I said, sure. why not take a look at something that's going to look at librarianship GLAM globally? That was the big draw for me. Where my interest, I love Canada, US, I want to read all about what's happening everywhere. And this book really did offer that. The experience was, it took, I want to say, about 2 months to read through, since I couldn't just be like, I'm going to spend all day reading this book. It was reading each chapter, taking very intense notes, and going into it reviewing, I definitely took the approach of who are they saying the intended audience of this book is for? They're saying it's a generalized audience, but do they actually mean that? Do they have a lot of technical terms, jargon, where it's this should be a bit more academic focused, which isn't a problem, but then you're approaching the book in a different way. You're reading it to go, I, as a person who is a librarian, I understand these terms, but would somebody who randomly picks this book up in the library understand the terms, or should they have done a little bit better indexing or explanations? And it really was a chapter by chapter thing.
Thanks, Kaya. Ashley.
Hey everybody, I'm Ashley Roach Freeman. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Library Instruction Curriculum Coordinator at the University of Memphis, and I am the editor of the Tennessee Library's peer-reviewed professional journal. So we do publish book reviews. I was previously the book reviews editor, so I did bring some of that experience in reading and editing reviews to my writing experience. And the book I reviewed was My Autobiography of Carson McCullers by Jen Chaplin. So I actually requested to write this review. I was already reading this book, and I did not know when I got into it that it had like a pretty substantial library archives, background narrative. And so that really piqued my librarian brain. And I wanted the opportunity to think more about a book that I was reading and that really meant a lot to me personally and as a librarian. So this book, it's a little bit more of like a popular title than you tend to see in library reviews. And it already had a fair amount of existing critical reception, but I really wanted to recommend it to any librarians who might be interested in how their work informs cultural thinking about writing, the history of queerness in literature, and personal identity. And I love that it supports the use of archives in writing in a way that felt like really tangible and more reflective than academic or scholarly. I suggested the review to Emily and was like really delighted at the support and consideration that I received in that process. For me as a reviewer, it was empowering to engage in the review process intentionally because I wanted to, and not because I felt like I should check off a box on like the path to promotion. So because I was already reading the book, I had some ideas already formed in terms of approaching the review. I wrote some notes, I identified pertinent sections to think about more deeply, and I drafted and revised the review before sending it to Emily for feedback. The whole thing was great and very easy.
Thanks, Ashley. Charlotte?
Hi, everyone. My name is Charlotte Rowe. My pronouns are she, her. And sorry, I'm getting over a cold. I reviewed Richard Jean So's Redlining Culture, a data history of racial inequality and post-war fiction. I was invited to review this book because it aligns directly with my research area, which is representation in publishing. So the experience of reading this book for me was a little traumatic because it is revisiting a site of my own personal trauma and experience in publishing. But at the same time, I think because of that, I was able to engage much more closely with the book than I think I would have otherwise. I really liked writing the review. It made me feel like part of the conversation rather than sort of the audience. And I think one thing you'll find in common with all of us who wrote these book reviews is that we're like selling our books, right? We're like, read this, you should read it. And that's, I think, what happens when you engage really closely and get to know something like a book so well. So.
Thanks, Charlotte. And I see a bunch of other folks who have reviewed for the journal in the room. Hi, Keegan. Hey, Emma. Nice to see you. And really glad to have you all here and great to hear everyone's experiences. We want to spend a little bit of time talking about next what role we all think book reviews play in academic librarianship. I'd like to invite one of the reviewers to kick off this discussion.
So I wouldn't mind kicking it off, Emily. This is Darren. I think that book reviews play a significant role, a really important role. I think the role is sort of underappreciated, but I think the role that book reviews can play and do play in some instances is important. And it's something that I think that we should be engaged in and promoting because all of us mentioned just the different experiences that we've had with book reviewing, but I think they were all fulfilling experiences, generally speaking. And like I mentioned earlier, the role that they play is underappreciated, but I think because book reviews are generally more widely read than, say, other forms of scholarship, I think it can play a central role in what we do as academic librarians.
Other thoughts on these questions? Kaya, Charlotte, or Mallory?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the most important thing is making the book discoverable through a book review. I think there are so many databases now that we all rely on at every level of academic research. And those databases don't necessarily include books, especially books that are not, published in this current year or in the last several years. And book reviews are really where those books can be found. I found this experience really, really true in my own research. I think if it wasn't for a book review, I wouldn't have found a really important historical book on Black book publishers in the United States, like really just a historical dictionary. Only reason I found it was because of a book review. So it's just really, really crucial for discoverability and maintaining knowledge around books that have been written.
I also think so book reviews play into academic librarianship, that it's a really great entryway for early career librarians to get published. So going back to what I was talking about history, it was in the class that I was in where you had to write a bunch of book reviews. Part of the way of thinking was that's how people in this field get published. It's an early way to get your name out there. And we don't necessarily think that way in librarianship. And I think this is a good space to have the conversation of changing that way of thinking. I know also for me, based on my own personal experience, I'm a former diversity resident librarian. And so being in that space, depending on like the institution that you're in, publishing is really important. But like in my own personal experience, there was not like a lot of somebody like mentorship when it comes to publishing, and being able to publish book reviews is a good way to kind of get your name out there and get that work done, and also just experience something and do something that is a little bit different than like, publishing a very long article or a book chapter or something like that. So that's been my experience, and I think that's how they can play into academic librarianship.
And jumping off that, it also, depending on institution, everything can really help with promotion and tenure in the field. I'm kind of an oddball here, where my first year at the University of Calgary, they're like, we expect you to do one book review. That will be your scholarship of the year. Check mark. And I'm like, great, I will give you 2 book reviews. This will be great. I can do this. And it's a wonderful way to equally stay up to date on the field, to like see what is any interest of research. I mean, reading through my giant book, I had a lot of things where, oh, I had a conversation with somebody about this topic. So it doesn't relate to me, but you may be interested in this specific chapter of a book that I'm reading in detail. And being able to make all these different connections, thinking article wise, thinking contact wise. And like Mallory was saying, it makes a great way to get your name out there publication wise, where suddenly people are talking about, oh, hey, this person reviews this sort of books. Maybe they would like to be reading this sort of book or something like this, and your name can start popping up. Yeah.
I want to add that it's also important for tenure and promotion for the author, right, of the book itself that we're reviewing, especially if they're, new in their career or not yet tenured. That's really, really important. And I was really gratified to see engagement. So it's Emily from the author on Twitter. Like they had reached out to say that we had said things in the review that they had not considered. And I think it's a good segue maybe.
I think Darren you had an experience like that also.
Yeah, I did. So I was really pleased to be able to work with the two authors that for the book I reviewed, Where Research Begins. They read my review and they actually invited me to be a part of another panel that they were conducting. And I've been able to develop a really good relationship with them and just getting feedback about the book review. Charlotte just mentioned some of the things I hadn't even thought about in reviews. I was able to sort of discover from my discussions with them. But I just wanted to briefly just mention some of the benefits of book reviewing. I think one, it allows us and helps us to read critically and improve our writing. So for me, that was another thing that I see as an important element of book reviewing. That not only can we review books and but it helps us in other areas that'll only help us professionally. So for me, that's another important part, sort of a benefit that may not necessarily be realized at initially.
In this year of our Lord 2023, I'm on mute. There are a couple of questions in the chat. I thought we could take a second to sort of discuss them. And I wonder if anyone in the panel has thoughts about reviewing a book that isn't good. And as a reviews editor, I've struggled with that as well. I don't want to ruin someone's day by trashing the book, and definitely have put in some time pulling people back from the brink in some reviews. But any thoughts on the panel about that question?
I could chime in on that. I think that is definitely something that we should consider. I've reviewed many books, and even when I review books that I didn't think that were as good as they may have been, I've always tried to find something positive to say about the book. I don't really see the point in just bashing a book completely. I think I appreciate the effort that the person has put into the book. And unless the book is just sort of horrible, I think that there's always something good and positive that you can take away from reading the book and reviewing it. And I just feel like I always try to find, well, what's positive about the book, and just build on that. I don't see the point in writing a overly negative book review.
Yeah, to add to that, I think like I'm looking at the chat and seeing the spaces, and I agree with what Ashley and Darren are saying. Especially to say that the writing is bad. Like to me, I'm a humanities major. I mostly work with the English department. Like writing is very subjective. And so I'm also not one to judge, but that's just me. So I guess if you can critique the parts that are bad and have like some type of meaning as to why they're bad and how you determine why it's bad, then that's one thing. But it's just so subjective. So it's really hard for me to be like, oh, a book is terrible. It's very hard for me to do that.
I think it's important to always attempt to judge a book not on what book you would have written or what you wanted to say, but if they do at some point say, here's the purpose of my book, here's what I'm doing with this, you have to definitely be fair to them. But I have published negative book reviews, and I worked really hard to try to find something good to say. It isn't useful for this, but for those of you looking for some of the resources they use to write this, it's good. Their bibliography is wonderful. Yeah.
Thanks for that, John. So we have another question for the group that we sort of discussed in advance to this question about what books ought to be reviewed. And I see the other questions in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. So I wonder if folks can chime in on sort of this question. What counts as a book worth our attention?
I can start if I was the first to unmute, I guess. I guess, as I mentioned in this instance, Emily was the one who suggested the book to me, right? It's like a Duke University Press media studies book, so not something I probably would have come across, but her prompt was to read with an eye to how the book applied to academic libraries in ways that we might not often think about. An assembly code is largely about logistics and communications infrastructure. And even though so much of librarianship is also largely about those things, from like interlibrary loan to open access infrastructure to questions of data privacy, I don't think we often discuss them in those terms. And so it was really fascinating to read that book, which doesn't really talk explicitly about libraries or archives, but to see how those two conversations could and should be happening together. So that's my brief bit there.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of go off of that. I think in a weird way, almost anything in the social sciences can be really very interestingly applied to librarianship. I think I think that, yeah, as you were just talking about, like your book didn't necessarily explicitly talk about librarianship, but yet the connections are all there. And so I think the more we can think about librarianship as like a really intersectional place in terms of like media studies and history of technology. I mean, there's all kinds of things that, and Emily's done an incredible job bringing in those into the book reviews. And I think I've really appreciated reading those reviews, because everyone does take a kind of an approach where it's like, these books aren't necessarily directly about librarianship, but hey, look at this connection, look at this connection. And as academics, I think that's really important. And that sort of goes a little bit, there was a question in the chat about what makes an academic review different. And I think it's those connections to the broader conversations within academia that make that academic book review more of an academic work, I guess. Yeah, so yeah, I just think the more books we can bring into librarianship and have people read reviews of them, the better we all are off.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, is it a book that you found meaningful? Is it a book that you want to share? Is it a book that you engaged with in your mind in a way that felt like it added something to the daily busyness of your job, or that you think might add something to someone else's? And I think I agree that any monograph, or someone suggested OER, or any, like, I think there are some places that are having like OER reviews now. And if someone knows that, please tell me. But yeah, is it a meaningful book? Do you want to share it with the world? Do you want to engage in the conversation? And do you want other people to do the same?
We'd also talked about this question in terms of the production and reproduction of academic hierarchies, that when a book is reviewed in college and research libraries, it says this book is important. And then we could do like, so how do we think about book reviews and the sort of question of power as it circulates in discourse?
I think that's a huge, oh, sorry, somebody else.
Go ahead, Anders.
Started before.
Okay, I can go.
Yeah.
Sorry, Zoom. I think often, and I've certainly been guilty of this, but when we're talking to students about how to identify book reviews and distinguish them from peer-reviewed articles, right? If their professors have asked them to find, 4 peer-reviewed articles or whatever, we say something along the lines of like, book reviews are descriptive, whereas articles are argumentative. But as we in libraries are aware, or definitely should be aware, description is sort of intrinsically editorial and analytical, and therefore ultimately a book review is argumentative as well, right? Making a case for or against a particular book, but also just in terms of how you are describing the book and what connections you're offering or seeing in it. And also discussing disrupting disciplinary boundaries as well, and making visible to one another texts that we might not encounter otherwise. So I think it could be used to sort of broaden sort of information literacy aspects of our jobs as well.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think one thing that is really important about the sort of specifically CNRL and other sort of higher, quote unquote, higher level journals in the librarianship field is that by reviewing books that aren't necessarily specifically about LIS, we can sort of challenge the field's preconceptions of what counts as academic librarianship. And I think that's really important because a lot of us read a lot of different kinds of stuff. And it's important to understand that we're we're not just reviewing the books that are practical in our field, right? We're trying to broaden that conversation about what it means to be an academic librarian through that book review. And I think that's really cool. And then just deliberately highlighting voices of traditionally marginalized folks. I mean, just like do it. That's just the work. And it helps to dismantle some of those like artificial silos we've created in LIS about like, like I really like to read books about classification systems, even though I have nothing to do with that in terms of my work. But I find it really interesting when people write reviews of those that aren't necessarily about cataloging, but then, yeah, I mean, I think the more we can do of creating that space in book reviews for people to read, that's really important.
I'm thinking about the question that we're discussing and the question that I essentially just asked, and thinking about when I look at books to include, I primarily look at university press books because we're in higher ed. And so let's review higher ed books. But do we see a role for, and Ashley, you wrote about a book that was outside of that genre. Should we take up other forms of cultural production in that review section?
Yeah, I thought about like what Tony said in chat about including and transcending academia. Book reviews are conditional to defending authors and titles under attack. And sometimes I feel like the conversation around books and censorship tends to get relegated to public libraries and advocates. And I do think that as good academic citizens and people who stand for representation and rights, like writing books that are more accessible to more people, but also are pushing at some of these political ideas about what should be represented in the classroom, for example, about race, about gender, about sexuality. We are helping other librarians make choices and give them opportunities to know that certain titles are recommended and supported. And I think that is something that we can use our position as reviewers to do, and especially in the pages of CNRL.
Yeah, I love that idea. And I think that it's also, I kind of find it fascinating what's coming out of quote unquote popular presses at times that actually makes a better argument than a lot of academic titles do, right? Because they're geared towards a different audience. And the more we can bring in some of that into academia, the better I feel like we all are off, because those folks are writing for who our students actually are, as opposed to writing for other academics. And that's a really kind of a big distinction. And sometimes that can help another librarian bring in that book to their classroom, or to use that in an info lit session or whatever it is. And that way we can like really broaden what counts as academic work.
I see a sort of genre of question in the chat that maybe we could talk about briefly. People like, I want to review a book, but how do I write a book review if I've never done that before? And I think, like some of you have said, that was a book review was my first published writing, it was like a review of a book. And I remember thinking it definitely was a fish out of water. It was like, I don't know, this book was good, and there is something different, right? When I'm reviewing a book, I have to sort of, I think one of you said tell the story of the argument, right? I think it's important. But how did you approach figuring out just even how to do a book review?
I can jump in at first. I think for me, the first thing I did was read other book reviews. Which is like, very, I don't know. But anyway, yeah, read other book reviews. Like that helped me a lot to kind of understand like, what is it that I'm trying to write? How do I want to approach how I'm reviewing this book? And then for me, my research interest is in vocational awe. So then I tied my research, which is also part of the book that I reviewed. So then I tied my interest to the book, especially with, because once again, my book has nothing to do with libraries. It has more to do with labor and capitalism. But to me, labor and capitalism has everything to do with libraries. And so it was kind of easy for me to tie the two together. so this can sound really cheesy and kind of like anti against the things I think about a lot, but think about like why you would review this book, like what's important or like passionate to you, and kind of tie that into why you're reviewing the book or what you think about the book. And that can help you a lot when you're trying to figure out how you actually write the book review.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in and one to agree with Mallory, and yeah, just read other book reviews. Read other book reviews and just be interested. As we were having this discussion, I was thinking about Walt Crawford's book. I think it's about 20 years old now, and I think the title of the book was something like "First Have Something to Say." And there have been other books by Carol Smallwood and other people who've written books about how to do reviews. So I would just say, start with perhaps one of those books, a book written about writing and academic publishing for academic librarians. And like Mallory said, just sit down and just, one, read a book, and two, just commence in, writing it. And I think once you start to write a book, and you will be able to work with editors to refine your work. But I think just do it. To use just another sort of corny slogan, but just sit down, find something you're interested in, and just commence to writing. And one of the things that I learned in reviewing the book that I reviewed was that, don't worry about perfection. Don't worry about this work being, perfect. If you have a 1,000-word limit, 1,500-word limit, I've written many reviews that had maybe a 600 or 500-word limit, and those are a little bit more difficult to write. But just sort of engage in a writing practice and refine your work as you move forward.
And going off of that, equally, I saw a question in the chat a little while ago about where do you find these books? Twitter, I follow several people on Twitter and they just go, hey, this book is coming out. I regularly check like publishers like Library Juice Press and say, what's forthcoming? Are any of these things interesting to me? I'll just put like a little thing in my calendar to be like, oh yeah, this book is coming out. I look at my local library, the like recently purchased titles, because randomly they'll get things like the complete guide for RFPs for libraries. And I'm like, I did not expect this book to show up, but I'm definitely interested. So just look around, even good old fashioned Googling on any research topic that you're interested in, you could probably find something that's published in the past 4 or 5 years that would be something no one has written on. You can do it.
I would also just add, I guess, 2 small things. One being read book reviews, definitely, as everyone is saying, but also like when I was thinking about how to review an edited collection, I was like, oh my gosh, do I have to like mention, right, there are 15 contributors. Do I have to mention every single one? How do I decide which? And so looking specifically at book reviews of edited collections or of whatever particular type of book you're reviewing or that kind of thing is helpful. And also, I guess this sort of ties back to the questions about what if you don't like the book, which I did like this book, but it sort of helped me to think about back to when I was in grad school for English and graduate seminars, where often the MO is just for insecure grad students to tear apart a text just so they can show that they understand it enough to criticize it. And thinking about how what was really more helpful to me in those seminars and when I encounter scholars in general is how people can be really generous and say, oh, there's this really interesting idea in this text. Let me sort of spin on that and see how it might develop rather than focusing on what we can all see as a flaw in logic or whatever. So I think just from a kind of a frame of mind that can be helpful as well.
Yeah, I want to add to that as like someone who worked in publishing and in the spirit of generosity, some authors don't get the editorial support that they should or need, right, in the process of writing the book, right? Like, I think in the comments, it was mentioned that there was a book on the history of medicine and the content was amazing, but the writing was bad. That to me says that somebody signed it knowing it was going to be good, but didn't or couldn't take the time to maybe guide an early author in, writing it more cleanly. I mean, or even do a good job copy editing, right? If grammar and spelling and that kind of thing was a problem. So keep in mind that some of these authors, especially of academic books, might not be getting the editorial support they need simply because a lot of university presses are understaffed, right? So.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's a big part. I certainly see that. I've seen that in a bunch of places. But I was going to kind of chime in too. I think one thing that helps me a lot is that I don't feel like I have to, in a review, is I don't have to address everything. Like, don't try to rewrite the book, right? Just try to find a thread that helps you explain what the book is about, without having to like rewrite the entire thing, because I certainly felt like at times I could have rewritten my entire book if I wanted to. You know, that wasn't helpful, right? Because it just bogs you down. Think about, like, as Darren said, like, you've got a word limit, you've got, you know, you do want to have those constraints on yourself, because otherwise you're going to end up down a rabbit hole you don't want to be down.
Yeah, I'm just gonna reiterate, like, when you are thinking about a review, engage your passion and curiosity, and not just your job, but like the ways in which those things intersect. And consider your personal bookshelf as an opportunity for review. I honestly wouldn't even have a problem reading reviews of older books that maybe have gotten lost in the shuffle. And think about like what you want to share with your peers and your larger community. And as like a little bit of a jumping off from that, I do think that like when writers sometimes select books from a list of available titles just because they're like, oh, I have to write a review this year, the reviews can have like a little bit of a boilerplate quality. So I think like going into like, you know, exploring that intersection of curiosity and librarianship really helps demonstrate to the reader that you have had an interest and engagement in this text.
I just
Yeah,
wanted to follow.
oh,
I'm
sorry,
sorry.
go ahead, Darren.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up Ashley's comments by saying that, and remember who you're writing for. You're writing for other librarians, right? We're writing for each other. We're writing to sort of promote, you know, scholarly dialogue amongst ourselves. So we may not be experts. You're writing out about a particular sort of, you know, field or subject, but what we're doing, we're trying to bring attention to these books. So I think that's the other thing to keep in mind: the audience and what is our purpose. I think our purpose is to share the knowledge and to bring attention to books that may not normally be read. And remember who you're writing for, which is us.
I love that, Darren. You're writing for us. We're writing for each other. I mean, I do think like book reviews are just a crucial node on the scholarly communication piece, right? That the importance for the reviewer to give us an opportunity. Well, I would even say, frankly, an opportunity to read a whole book, which is maybe something we don't always do all that often, especially with professional literature. So for me, having a book review deadline means that I actually read the book. So that is value in that. But also just, you know, thinking about and it's been good for me to see on social media when I connect the author of the book and the reviewer and see some of that, sometimes some back and forth go on. You can see that the conversation really is happening. That scholarly conversation that we teach about in the classroom is something that's happening in our field as well. We just have a few minutes left. I wondered if anyone on the panel would like to say any final things, and then I'll wrap up with a couple of housekeeping items for College and Research Library reviewers. And I hope that we just got an additional 122 of them from the call here. Would you all do it again? Review?
Oh, yes.
Excellent.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yes. So I just wanted to close and invite Kristen Totleben, our editor-in-chief. I will be rotating out of the book review editor position. It's been a just absolutely amazing experience for me. It's been an opportunity to meet with so many librarians and talk to them about so many ideas. And I love working with other people's texts because otherwise I have to write my own. And so the editor position has been really wonderful. And Kristen, do you want to just share with us about the book reviewer position and the timeline for replacing that? Oh, you're muted, Kristen.
Of course I am. Hello, everyone. Before saying this, I just want to thank all the panelists and all the audience for coming to this webinar and this discussion. Really, it's really made me rethink about book reviews, and I love to hear everyone has spoken with passion today about help, it's writing for each other. But I wanted to let you know, so this spring, we will be posting the job for the book reviews editor and also for the social media editor. So Emily Dervinsky is our book reviews editor, and Ellen Filgo, who's also here on Zoom, is our social media editor. And I posted in the chat the way that the job descriptions were written when the search went out last time. I don't believe there will be anything different to add for the book reviews editor position, but I'm not sure about the social media editor yet. But please, if you're interested, I highly encourage you to apply. Keep an eye out. Sometime within the next month or so, we'll be posting it on the journal site and other places. And I hope that this discussion has encouraged you to write a book review or to suggest books. So we're all part of the same community, and I'm glad you're here.
Thanks, Kristen. And I do still have a few months on the clock, and I'm actively seeking reviewers. I do my best to take a look at the books coming out, scan the field and see who's writing and try to do those connections. But I am open to queries from everyone. And so please reach out to me if you're interested in writing a review, if you have a book that you're like, people need to know about this, or if you're like, I want to write a book review and I really love animals. Can you help me find a book about animals to review? Maybe not quite animals, but you know what I mean. Please reach out to me and I will put my email address in the chat. And I see some people here to whom I owe emails. Mimosa, I'm going to get back to you. It's just with the LibLearnX conference coming up, I've been a bit swamped. But I want to thank the reviewers who joined us to share their perspectives and experiences on the panel here today, and everyone in the audience for joining us. Thank you so much. And please stay in touch and be in touch. And if you are going to be at the ALA member meeting, I will be there in about 5 minutes and I will see you all there. So thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great afternoon. I'm going to stop recording.